Ahead, I'll talk with Dr. Peter Rabins about Alzheimer's and memory loss. Dr. Peter Rabins is the author of Is It Alzheimer's? 101 Answers to Your Most Pressing Questions About Memory Loss and Dementia. And he's the co-author, along with Nancy Mace, of The 36-Hour Day, a family guide to caring for people with Alzheimer's disease, other dementias, and memory loss. I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Dr. Rabins, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We're going to talk about two books today, and the second one, Is It Alzheimer's?, grew out of the earlier book, The 36-Hour Day. So let's start with this newest book, Is It Alzheimer's? There's so much information in here, we're not going to be able to talk about it all, so give us a brief overview of what readers are going to find here.
Sure. Well, over the years of my career, I've given a number of talks to the public, and I always save about half of the time for questions. And what I've found is that, people ask the questions that are important to them and get right to the point. And some people have told me that the 36-hour day is either too long or just has too much information. So I got the idea, why not write down the 101 most common questions and try to answer those very directly and succinctly. So that's how the Is It Alzheimer's book arose.
Well, let's start from the very beginning. The first question in the book is, should I be concerned about my memory? Because all of us experience some things, and it makes us wonder what's going on. And is this normal, or is this something I should be concerned about?
That's absolutely a common question. That's why I started with it. The answer is that as we all age, it becomes harder for us to come up with words and names. That's a common thing. It actually begins in our 30s, but we tend not to really notice it until our 60s. So if your only problem with memory is coming up with a name or a specific word, and particularly if it floats into your head a minute or even a day later, that seems to be usual or normal aging. One should be concerned if there are things that you've always done pretty easily and automatically, and they're becoming harder, whether it's logging into a computer or using a microwave or organizing something. Anything like that, I think, absolutely should make people concerned and should have their memory evaluated.
As someone once put it to me, forgetting where you parked your car is normal. Forgetting that you own a car, that's cause for concern.
That's a great way to say it succinctly, yes.
So let's talk about those times when we should be concerned in a bit more detail. How do we know when, again, this is just something normal, or it might be leading to Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia?
Well, I think one thing to be aware of is it's often other people who notice even more than we do. So if someone says, you just asked me that question 5 or 10 minutes ago, that would be concerning, particularly if you don't remember that you've already answered it. So repeating yourself, actually saying words wrong. So instead of saying the word, say pen, you say the word peel. That kind of error would be concerning. Getting lost in a familiar route, that would be worrisome. Even if you ultimately figure it out, if you've driven somewhere frequently and have trouble with that would be more concerning. So it's a real change from what you used to be, I think, is what should make people seek out attention.
So let's talk about a couple of terms. Because, we hear about Alzheimer's, we hear about dementia. Are those two things related or what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that because that's another really common question. And even some doctors and nurses are confused by it. Alzheimer's disease is a specific illness, whereas the umbrella term dementia refers to any disease that affects how a person is thinking. So there are about 100 or so different illnesses that can cause thinking impairment. Alzheimer's is the most common, and beginning at age 65 or so becomes more and more common. So Alzheimer's is a specific disease in which the changes in the brain were identified more than 100 years ago. And it's those specific brain changes under the microscope that define the disease.
So the question I think many people must have, and I know you cover in your book, is Alzheimer's something that just happens naturally with age, or are there things we can do to prevent it, becoming an issue for us?
Yeah. It's absolutely not normal. It does become more common as we age, but so do many cancers, for example. So it is in some way age associated, and we don't understand that yet. But it's clearly distinct, I believe, from usual aging.
So what can we do to prevent Alzheimer's?
There's a tremendous amount of research on that. It's a hard topic to study, but I think a few things are really clear. The first is that one of the biggest risk factors is having high blood pressure in midlife. So in your 40s and 50s. So if any listener has high blood pressure, get that aggressively treated, even when you feel perfectly well. That probably explains about 20% of the cases of Alzheimer's, and right now is in my estimation, the most preventable element. Also, anything else that's associated with blood vessel disease, like high cholesterol, for example. So there are some studies that show that changing your diet to a more Mediterranean-like diet, so-called, meaning less meat, doesn't mean no meat, but less red meat, more vegetables, fruits, nuts, that sort of thing. That also seems to benefit people. And then there's exercise and mental activity. Keeping physically and mentally active does seem to delay or prevent the onset. At least there's reasonable evidence for that. So trying to exercise 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week is almost universally recognized for prevention.
Tell us about some of the other progress being made in the field of Alzheimer's, including, I understand there's been new drugs that have been approved. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah. The reason that I came out with a new edition of the 36-hour a day is because there have been three really major advances that are really important. The first is we now have tests to help with the diagnosis. So prior to about 5 years ago, doctors evaluated people and then put all the information together to make a diagnosis. And depending on the person's accuracy and ability, doctors were right 60 to 90% of the time. That's, 60 is pretty bad, 90's A minus, B plus, still not really good. We now have brain scans called PET scans that can measure how much of the abnormal amyloid protein is in the brain. And recently approved were blood tests that can actually measure the abnormal proteins in the blood. The important thing about getting the tests is that if you're normally functioning and your memory's fine, you shouldn't get the test. And the reason is because many people have this abnormal amyloid protein in their brain, but are totally normal. So the big advance in diagnosis is if someone has symptoms, even early symptoms, getting one of these tests to find that there is the amyloid protein in the brain helps diagnose Alzheimer's. So that's a huge advance. And then second, as you mentioned, Ron, there are now two medicines approved by the FDA to treat Alzheimer's disease. And these drugs work by removing that abnormal amyloid beta protein from the brain. And amazingly, over 12 to 18 months, these drugs remove up to 90% of this abnormal protein. So that's quite incredible. However, as far as improvement, on average, people improve about 7% more than they would from a sugar pill or placebo. So the benefit right now of these drugs is pretty modest. We're beginning to see evidence, though, that the drugs might change the long-term course of the disease, meaning it might slow down its getting worse. So if that turns out to be true, catching it as early as possible might mean that we can really prolong a person's period of functioning well. So that's important. And the third advance is that we're now recognizing that the risk of Alzheimer's, the rate of it occurring in the population, is declining. This is quite extraordinary because I think it gets back to your question about prevention. We're doing something better now than we did 20 or 30 years ago. And again, people are still trying to sort out what that is, but I think it's a combination of the things that I just mentioned. Getting high blood pressure treated, people becoming more physically active than they used to, and people eating better. I think that all those things are happening at a population level. And in multiple countries around the world, it's been shown that the rate of getting it seems to be going down. So that's a great point, I think.
Well, Peter, earlier you mentioned that Is It Alzheimer's grew out of the 36-hour day book, which is now, as you mentioned, has been revised to include new information. But for those who would like a more comprehensive look at Alzheimer's and how it's treated and how we can help people with Alzheimer's, give us a brief overview of what people will find in this book.
Yes, well, this book came out of our attempt to help caregivers better care for people. So more than half of the book really focuses on how can you manage specific symptoms if a person is wandering or suspicious or withdrawn or overactive. So it's very focused on the specific problems that people develop. Now, not everybody develops every problem. So we tried to be encyclopedic, that is, cover every problem that families tell us about. And one of the things that we've learned is that solving these kinds of problems is trial and error. You may try one thing and it doesn't work, but there are 3 or 4 other things to try after that. So the book is really a compilation of things that families have told us about what worked for them and our findings as clinicians, doctors, nurses, social workers about what works. So that's a large part of the book. We also do talk about what is Alzheimer's, what are other causes of dementia, and what are the symptoms of these other diseases. We talk about the medical evaluation. And then we also talk about current research, not just about drugs, but what do we think is actually going on and what is triggering this? And for example, we've learned now that the disease begins in the brain 20 years or so before first symptoms. So the question then is, well, what might be triggering that? And we try to talk about some of the possibilities of what's triggering it.
Again, this is another book. We don't have time to talk about everything in here, but I do want to touch on a couple things that I think folks will be interested in. And one is if you do have a situation where you have a loved one that you need to find professional help for, a home that will take care of them, what should we be looking for?
Okay. So it's an important question because somewhere between 30 and 50% of people with Alzheimer's disease do need long-term care out of the home, and it's the disease. One of the important myths that we really work hard in the book to break is that it's not a failure to place a loved one in long-term care. My clinical experiences is most people wait too long until there's absolutely no alternative. And so we do discuss what are some of the things that you should do to try to find the best place. I think first is you want to be practical. You want to find a place where you can get to relatively easily so that you can visit whenever you want to. Picking a place an hour away means it's going to be harder to visit. I think the second thing is if you know someone else who's faced the same question, ask them what are they happy with the place that they found? I think third, ask your doctor or nurse or social worker, do they know of the better places in your area? And then fourth is to visit places, see what they're like. Are people active? Are they engaged? Now, some people are so severely impaired that they are in a wheelchair and they really can't be particularly active. So that is not necessarily a failure. But if everybody is just sitting around and not interacting with the staff or other residents, that's not a good sign. And smell the place. Does it smell clean and fresh, or does it smell uriniferous? That would be a pretty negative sign. So those are some of the things that I recommend that people think about. And don't wait till the end. If it's starting to get really difficult, start asking people, looking around, so that you've got time to make the right decision.
The other thing I wanted to give you a chance to talk a bit about is a situation where it may not be you providing care in home, but you know someone who is, and that person who is providing that caretaker role, it can be very, very difficult for them. So what kind of emotional support can you give to someone who's providing care for someone who's dealing with Alzheimer's?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that question. I mean, that's really what the title of the book is, that for caregivers, often the day feels like it's 36 hours day long. I think first is to work to maintain your relationship with that person. Many caregivers are so tied into caregiving that they can't think about getting out of the house, going to church, going shopping, doing something that they enjoy. And so their friends and family have to reach out to them. I think second is offer to help. Is there some way that maybe you could come in an afternoon a week or spend a few hours and let the person just get away, get out, do something on their own, whether that's shopping or going to a movie or having coffee with a friend or a loved one. I think that's very important. Encouraging, making sure that person's taking care of their own health needs. Many caregivers start to neglect their own health. So if somebody seems like they're having some kind of medical or physical problem, urge them to get help for themselves, both to help them and to help the loved one with dementia, because if they get sick, it really affects both of them adversely. And be persistent. If the person, I'm just too busy, say, well, how about if we talk on the phone? Or how about if I just come over and we sit and have a cup of coffee? Realizing that it can be overwhelming for a loved one or a good friend, I think, is the first step. And don't pussyfoot around in having a conversation. If you're concerned about the person's well-being, say, gee, it looks like you're struggling. What can I do to help you? Raise that issue. And finally, if the person just seems so stuck that they're really having trouble themselves, recommend that they talk to their doctor about getting some help. I think that's important. We can't control everything in our lives, and something like caregiving can totally consume us, sometimes in a negative way.
There's a wealth of information here, and to learn more, the books are Is It Alzheimer's? 101 Answers to Your Most Pressing Questions About Memory Loss and Dementia. It's by Dr. Peter V. Rabins. And a book he co-authored with Nancy Mace called The 36-Hour Day, A Family Guide to Caring for People with Alzheimer's Disease, Other Dementias, and Memory Loss. Dr. Rabins, thank you for talking with me today.
Dan, thanks again for having me.
If you'd like to purchase either of the books we've discussed in this interview, I've placed links for you in the description below. If you appreciate this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.